Welcome to Tilt, a podcast from the Santa Fe Art Institute. After Spaniards arrived in the Americas, they introduced a rigid caste system that attempted to define all the new mixtures of people born from miscegenation. In this episode of Unsettled, Alicia, Christian, and Diego debunk those designations and the binaries they created, while also following the strands of multiple ancestral lineages. This is episode 5, part 7, titled Colores Sospechos.
You are listening to Unsettled.
Now you're talking sense.
Got this pine cone in my brain, got my eyes open, I'm saying it's that wake up, that breaking free for them chains. It's that welcome to a new age, this right here for like a new wave. Third eye open wide, no flow ride, I decalcify, open up them lotus petals, higher free, no lower levels.
There's stories in Carnuel when in the 1860s or whatever it was, in the long walk of Bosque Redondo, when the Navajo, the Dene, were coming back from after the treaty. They were starving, left to die, and they camped out in our creek. And women were making bread and butchering animals to feed the Dene for 2 weeks till they could get strong to make it back. There's stories of the Comanches dropping off small bands that were being hunted by the Texas Rangers and the U.S. government. They were dropping off elderly and young kids and being like, "We're going to come pick them up back up," but they never did. They were left here. So that went on until the early 1800s, and then what happens is, then all of a sudden the U.S. government's trying to take over our forest lands and whatever. Fast forward to the early 20th century, we were in court. We went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and our land grant was shrunk from 90,000 acres to 2,000 acres. The way the economics shifted is Carnuel, at the edge of the city of Albuquerque, landed up. The upper villages started asking for allotments of land at the edge of Albuquerque, which is our borderlands. And because people started taking up work on the railroad or work in those sort of industries, and then World War II happened. So our struggle is to survive of our dances of the Comanches and the Matachines and where we survive now and how we maintain is adaptation, right? We had to adapt from the buffalo being annihilated. We had to adapt from some of our most important trade partners move to places that they weren't used to. I mean, the Comanche were our neighbors and our business partners, but they didn't exist anymore. We had people that the Jicarillas and Apache and Mescaleros that we warred with, we had to help support and bring them into our communities for survival. And so right now, what we exist as a community with our shared, again, I'll use the term in Spanish, mutualismo, our shared mutualism, our shared experience. Because if we don't continue to work together to survive, we won't exist anymore. And that's why we have to collaborate between where we are today. Like we're sitting right now, and we're in a room outside of our brewery. So what do? We became good bootleggers. A lot of folks here were really good at Tesquino, which is a corn beer, and a corn beer whiskey. We had one of the oldest speakeasies in New Mexico. We have a brewery. We have cell towers. We buy land back. We're not asking the government for a dime. In fact, they take more in taxes than what they give back. And so, maybe we're not hustling, not hustling salt anymore, and maybe we're not hustling, captive kids that are selling active in the slave market Santa Fe, which is a sad history, but we are selling growlers, and if you could, we have a good price on growlers if you remember. So, we sell a lot of beer to our settler neighbors, and we have to work with them too. We kind of, they help support our economic viability, and that's where we are today.
Diego and I decided to visit Moises Gonzalez in Carnuel, a land-grant community located at the base of the Sandia Mountains. The name, he said, derives from the Tiwa word for Badger Place. When we arrived, the sun was low in the sky, and Moises was ready to give us a tour of the old adobe home he was renovating. As he opened the large wooden barn doors, he talked about his vision for the building. It was going to be a place to feed people during funciones. Now it was just 4 walls and a pile of rubble. The renovation had become a homegrown archaeology project. As Moises continued to pull back the layers, the building got more rascuache. The walls were made with puddled adobe mixed with old corn cobs, and at some point someone added state pen brick to the structure, concrete and river rock. It was the art of making do, of being resourceful.
So I think that starts blending itself to the marketing of this tricultural myth, where you're Pueblo, Anglo, and then the Spanish. And then what happens, there's these divides between Spanish and Pueblo that becomes this binary structure that anybody like Genizaros or any mixed indigenous people can't fall in, because they'll never be accepted by the Spanish, because they just should fit into the project, right? And then you're not indigenous enough because you act different, and so what it almost creates, and then those that in these mountain communities that, I think a lot of folks in the mountain communities up here, unlike maybe Las Cruces, is that there was already othering from people like Abiquiu or people like Truchas or Cordova or like in these mountain villages like Ranchos de Taos. And so it's not until like modern day that I think with live streaming and somebody will take a picture of a relative dancing and they'll put it on the internet, that I think in the last decade where people are like, well, what's that? And what's that? And so now I think, people are seeing things in these rural villages that they never saw before through maybe new technologies, and people are asking questions. And then I think people are like now to the point where they're willing to talk a little bit more, because I think it was shunned. And so what that led to is, so I think that's maybe the change. Although I think there's still these politics of recognition that exist obviously within the Spanish pageantry, or this idea of the Santa Fe fiestas, or the idea of maintaining Pueblo culture that, if, you either are one of these or you're not, and you don't fit in. So I think in Santa Fe or in northern New Mexico, if you're against the Española fiesta, if you're against the pageantry of Santa Fe, then somehow again you're not part of the project. You're not useful to promoting the existing economic development structure in the state, the arts, Spanish market or Indian market. Nothing exists for Chicano,
Like
Genizaro,
right.
Rascuache market.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Called Rascuache market.
Yeah, there's no Rascuache market but for Genizaros and Cholos, right?
The word binary came up a lot in our conversation, almost as much as the words "it's complicated." From the Latin binarius, the term in its earliest usage meant two together. In time, however, it began to connote duality and opposition. Now when I hear it, I think of two poles that leave no room for anything in between.
So you have what we call in Spanish Carencia, where you have this sense of belonging and relationship to place, to your land, to your community, to your cultural dances, to this collective, what I would say, this Genizaro consciousness. And then, and that's important, because once that's lost, part of what there's a danger, and what I call, and again in recognition politics, is that you're either driven to kind of believe that you need to be part of this this productive acculturation to be Spanish American, therefore project whiteness. So then you become part of the project. Or, but the problem is, and then if you claim that you're indigenous, the problem through, then there's this whole aspect of that's portrayed on the idea of the card holding native, which, then you're saying, well, you're not this, you're not that. So what you're stuck is this in-between space. And when you're stuck in this in-between space, you can either destroy you or really mess with you or really create aspects, and I think of alcoholism and drug abuse or all these different kind of things, as opposed to creating a community of cultural or a collective awareness and collective economic investment or collective, we call in Spanish mutualismo, mutualism, right? Mm-hmm. This idea where we create mutual aid for the benefit of our community, right? So we kind of, we suffer in times of suffering together, and we make it through times of benefit by us working together.
The question that we ask in this episode seems simple enough. What exists in between the binary? The answer, like much of the work we've already done, takes us in all directions, even a few that are contradictory and hard to swallow. But if we truly want to seek truth and not just march to the tune of productive acculturation, as Moises says, then we need to complexify ourselves and our stories, to come to terms with how, in the first years and now centuries after contact, miscegenation was always a rule and never an exception. Even so, New Mexico is still an inheritor of a binary way of thinking, of shoehorning people of mixed descent into tiny identity compartments. American annexation and the tourism machine only carved deeper grooves between people, making us forget parts of ourselves and our extended families. But this land has long been blessed by many feet and honored by countless prayers in different tongues. The ancestral Puebloan and Mogollon people, themselves preceded by holy ancestors, among others created spearhead cultures that would end up being the common roots of many diverse communities in New Mexico. From them originate a beautiful strata of people, primos and primas, kin. It's a disservice to limit this story, to make so many of us of so many ancestries only pick one. It would be like looking at the whites, reds, yellows, greens, and browns of an Abiquiu Canyon and calling them all gray. Here in this humble place are also the descendants of kings and queens, chiefs and prophets, heirs of biblical Aaron tending land in mountain villages, and Moctezuma's children's children's children dancing matachines in both Pueblo and Manito communities. Identities have further shifted with nation building, ethnic blending, acculturation, migration, globalization, and yes, the multi-directional histories of slavery. As a result, the ethnic, spiritual, and cultural ancestors that currently inhabit New Mexico's people in various combinations are Tewa, Tiwa, Tano, Carey, Zuni, Hopi, Pito, Manso, Suma, Tompedo, Comanche, Ute, Pawnee, Kiowa, Ojibwa, Absalaga, Ende, Dene, Tlaxcalteca, Raramuri, Mexica, Yueme, Amazi, or Berber, Wanche Canarian, Arabic, Sephardi, specifically Kohanim, African, Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Greek. There are countless more. In many ways, we don't even have words for these blended identities. We simply are them, and they are us.
Follow young people, where we followed the young Don Diego guy throughout the summer. We followed the choir dancer for Zozobra, and we followed a young Santo Domingo and half Navajo woman who agreed to be a part of the Indian Princess contingent thing. So we knew that's how we were gonna do the document. We were following these three young people. But at the same time that year, the Don Diego's, what's the word for his group of men? Quadrilla.
Yeah.
That year, a young San Ildefonso man named Randy Canatobi worked at St. Vincent's, and he had made friends with people who were on the quadrilla, and they invited him to be a part of the quadrilla. And so in the interview, he said, I just thought it was going to be a lot of fun, and they were my friends, and I agreed. And then, so I knew to follow him because he had no idea. So I kept my camera on him during the times we were shooting. And they were doing the rehearsals for the script, the entrada. So we were at those rehearsals, and the script was awful. And both the Don Diego guy and Randy were trying to tell the older people, that entrada organizational group, to change it, because they were doing many moons, they were, and both Randy and that young guy, Don Diego, tried to get that script changed, and they didn't. So we just kept watching them as they progressed through the summer, going to schools, dancing, conquistador outfits, we got all that, and just kept my eye on Randy. And sure enough, come the time of the entrada, that Sunday afternoon, he shows up, and they're gathering in the gas company New Mexican parking lot. You know where that is, kind of?
Yeah.
Everybody's gathering there. And I got there, and the people who put on the entrada, there's a name for them. I forgot what their name.
The council.
But, pardon?
The Fiesta Council.
It's actually that side group.
Oh.
It's not. It's the one who puts on the entrada. There's Caballeros de Vargas. That's what it is. Yeah. So I show up, and the Caballeros de Vargas bring in their friends and stuff, and they're starting to put on those awful wigs, those awful, the gunny sacks, the everything. And I'm going, shit. And Randy hasn't showed up yet. And then Randy shows up, and he brings his nephew, little 10-year-old, 12-year-old, looks like. And they're both dressed in beautiful ribbon shirts, the whole Northern Pueblo attire. And I have him on camera saying, they look pretty much more savage than I do. And but then you can tell his close friends are also getting uncomfortable by this happenstance. And so Don Diego walks up and to Randy, and he whispers something in his ear, and I don't know to this day what he said. And then Randy goes to be with his friends, and they're commenting on his attire. And at that point, one of those guys on the Fiesta Council comes by with a headdress and wants Randy to put it on. And Randy says, no. And Randy, you can tell, is already upset at that point. And his close friends are upset. So they all walk down to the plaza to do the entrada. And by that time, Randy is in tears. And they haven't even gone up yet. And I have this all on camera.
Diane Reyna was the director of Surviving Columbus in 1992. And that same year, the cinematographer of Gathering Up Again, Fiesta in Santa Fe. The year marked the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, and the 300th anniversary of the reconquest of Santa Fe after the Pueblo Revolt by Don Diego de Vargas. Diane, who is from Taos Pueblo, observed the fiestas from behind the camera. At the Cross of the Martyrs, where one procession gathered, she said she saw Catholicism, Santa Fe politics, and money all come toward her at once. The Franciscan priest who presided over the gathering that night said, "What we should be celebrating is the failure of conquest." Like others from New Mexico, Diane said that people don't know their history. It too easily gets oversimplified and even caricatured to the point that caricature is taken as truth, especially in the context of the Santa Fe fiestas. As I watched Gathering Up Again for the first time, I realized the whole event was based on a series of projections of what Spanish-identifying people thought indigeneity looked like and should look like for the purposes of a celebration of Spanish conquest. But it was also a projection of what Spanish-identifying people wanted Spanish identity to look like too, with all the costumes, speeches, pageantry, and romance that came with it. It was like trying to perform what you desired history to look like, rather than what actually was. And what actually was not velvet and valiant under rehearsed speeches.
The denial of mixture which means, because if you know your history and you know your culture, you know that Hispanics and Native people have been intermingled. They are related. They baptized each other's children. They raised at Taos Pueblo in the early, like mid 1800s to the 1900s, Hispanic people would bring their children to the village to be raised. You know what I mean? People forget about that. There was an ongoing relationship. It wasn't conquistadors and pueblos. That happened at the beginning. But as history went along and as people started coming back up with different attitudes, we became neighbors for a long time, and relationships. We're all related. And so I see the problem is when people don't know their cultural and historical history, they see things in black and white and right and wrong. And then they react to that instead of really looking at themselves and acknowledging all parts of themselves, because that's at the core of this whole thing. That's right. At the core. Either it's from the Hispanic people and hardcore quote unquote Spanish that just really think they're descended, that they came across from Spain all the way to New Mexico without stopping off in Mexico or Central America, as they made that long year, things happened. So we're mixed. And that, I think that's the bottom line. What are we talking about? When you attack another person, you're attacking yourself. You don't know if you're related to them.
When you attack another person, you're attacking yourself. It's like, let the first person without sin cast the first stone kind of realness. And to that end, Diane readily admits her own mixed roots. As an example, her last name is spelled Reyna. Her brother, she told me, traced the spelling and the first reinas in New Mexico all the way back to Jewish conversos who came to the Americas from Spain. Talk about what we're talking about, she said, just before explaining that her mom was from Oquehue and that her Hispanic relatives came from Pilar, a village located on what we now know as the Low Road to Taos. It was once an area frequented by Jicarilla people. Later, in 1694, Don Diego de Vargas burned the Jicarilla village as part of the Reconquest. 100 years after that, it was established as a land-grant community.
And I've been a part of all these types of, I was a part of the Oñate controversy in Albuquerque because I'm close friends with Nora Naranjo Morris, and when she got involved with that, we went through hell, because of these things. Right. She got attacked by Pueblo people for participating in that. It was. I've been witness to so much awfulness. Those kinds of public hearings, and it's just awful. It's just terrible. But my other thought is that if you don't understand New Mexico history and especially northern New Mexico history is critical, but that's because I'm from it, so I kind of really know that. But what was I going to say? Not only the relationship, not only the mixture, but I also believe that the people who actually identify themselves as Spanish, they do that for a reason, because I am sure through their own personal history, they were put down as and denigrated by Anglos maybe or other people. So when you're denigrated like that, you who's under me that I can denigrate, right? So that's a lot of this. It's internalized oppression.
Now, as we seek to remember and recover the complexity of ourselves and our lineages, it's about time to take a chancla to the myth that anybody was ever puro español in the first place, even if the Spanish themselves were so downright concerned with documenting hierarchies of racial purity and so-called impurity. The question is why? Why continue to map and remap difference? Remember what Bjorn said of white supremacy? At its root is a sense that power is in constant threat of slipping away. As a result, you have to manufacture ways of rationalizing staying in power. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, they introduced a rigid caste system to make sense of all the people born out of contact. There are even paintings that actually try and depict all of the combinations of mestizaje in a grid layout. Typically, Spaniards are listed in the first square as the kind of paradigm of whiteness. Then begins the formula. Español plus indígena equals mestiza. Mestiza plus española equals castiza. There were terms like peninsular, a Spanish-born person in Spain, and criollo, a Spaniard born in the Americas. These are terms many of us may have heard or at least expect. Then there are the lesser-known designations, cholos, or people of mostly indigenous descent with some Spanish heritage, pardos, those of Spanish, African, and indigenous descent, zambo, or the child of a mulatto and a mestizo. As squares in the grid get further away from whiteness and thus away from the idea of civility, the names for people of mixed descent continue to get more and more bizarre, such as torna atrás, which literally means turn back, and tente en el aire, or hold yourself in midair. In all of these instances, the darker the complexion, the less civilized the person. I've even seen a square in one of these casta paintings showing a woman with dark brown skin knocking her husband over the head with a frying pan. This was the visual culture of projection. But at the end of the day, this whole dog and pony show was really to disguise the fact that Spanish identity was the real construct. As such, it needed a vocabulary of otherness on which to define itself against. A binary, you might say. Here in New Mexico, Miguel Torres's research into ecclesiastical records shows some similar linguistic contortions. One sacramental record describes Juan Andrés Muñiz, who married Maria Josefa Martín, both of Embudo, as mulatto. Muñiz, who is Miguel's ancestor, showed a presence in the Trampas and Ojo Caliente areas as well. In some references, Andrés Muñiz and his brother Lucrecio are listed as Genízaro. Elsewhere, they are mulatto and coyote. Their grandchildren are later listed as españoles. Another marriage that Miguel found in the records designates the two people españoles de colores quebrados, or Spanish of broken colors. Another says of sangre sospechosas, or of suspicious blood. And yet another still says de color sospechosa vecinos de Pohuaque, or of suspicious color and neighbors of Pohuaque. Other terms included India Pacha, comprada a los Comanches, Indios de la Gentiles, Coyota, and Genízaro. These are just the tip of the mixed ancestry iceberg, according to Miguel, who conducts genetic genealogy research in northern New Mexico. Miguel invited Christian, Diego, and I to Santa Cruz, where we spoke in the Comedor, a rectangular building located just adjacent to the Morada. Christian said it had the same vibe as a clubhouse.
Families in New Mexico also match to that. And what's weird is that a lot of families that match to that are families that are in the mountainous regions, like Cordova and Truchas.
Can you repeat this when you record? This is so
I started recording. I was like,
Yeah.
This is so good.
But what really strikes me as odd as you have these people, and I'm not saying that they were crypto Jews, right? Because that's beyond that conversation. But I'm just saying that these people link to that history, and then they get here to northern New Mexico, and they're the people that appear to be willing to migrate into those villages and communities that also are developed by Genízaro people, and also it's how has it happened? And oral histories kind of say that, but genetic science is proving it. So there's lots of families in Cordova and Tuchas today, Romeros and other families, and they have this paternal link to this Kohanim, but they have tons of ancestors on other branches that are related to Genízaros, and their genealogies are proving it. Their genetic results prove it. And we know the history of the Tano people in this region, right? Lots of them stayed here. And so if you see people in Cordova, to me, right, Pueblo Quemado, as it was previously known, I mean, you just look at those people and you can see it. It's In this book, oh shoot, I didn't bring it. in the Nación Genízaras, in my chapter, I give a little example of the mitochondrial.
I have that book, so.
Look in that in my chapter. There's in the mitochondrial example. I did a real short case study, and it's of this population of people in New Mexico whose mitochondrial DNA, mitochondrial DNA is your mother's 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 mother, right? So links to these people of the 1600s, and this population of people is found all through this Santa Cruz Valley up into, and it's spread throughout New Mexico over time, right, through the diaspora, but their concentration is here, and then also found in Abiquiu. And then there's a contemporary guy, a friend of mine, who lives out in the he lives in Albuquerque now, Nate Francis.
Yeah, I know him.
Nate's maternal DNA links to these people.
Right.
Wow. So currently he links to all these Chicano, Hispanic, Genízaro identifying people of Abiquiu or the Santa Cruz Valley and beyond, right? But his identity, his history tells him that he's quote unquote 100% Native American, right? Right? He doesn't have anything to disprove that other than, he has some oral histories about how his people had migrated to where they were from this region.
Yeah.
Right? Those are just oral histories. But genetic science is linking him to all these histories, and it's striking how many of these people have these roots in these villages and communities that I mentioned. It's really supporting this history.
Yeah, it's so interesting. The weird solidarity between people of crypto-Jewish descent and Genízaros is something that I think is really fascinating about northern New Mexico, because there is this interesting convergence of those two groups who are both diaspora populations that ended up creating communities together with shared tradition and stuff. Both of them are underground traditions, right? There's the Jewish tradition, which wasn't very public facing, and then of course the Genízaro tradition was the same thing too. So it's really interesting. These communities have that weird convergence of these people that have shared histories with exile, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's to me it's really astonishing, right, to think about it in that way. And for the most part, I would say the greater population of our people here in New Mexico for a long time have just not really thought about that kind of stuff, right?
Miguel began his own personal research journey as a teenager when he asked that same existential question that many of us ask. Who am I? Inspired in part by Isaac de la Rocha of Rage Against the Machine, who was himself inspired by the Zapatistas, Miguel started seeking answers in an attempt to uncover a papered-over history of complexity.
Would you say that identifying, because I'm from southern New Mexico, and so no one down there identifies as Spanish, right? It's really weird that up here a lot of people do. But would you, it's bizarre to say the least, but would you say, based on your genealogical research, that identifying as Spanish is an accurate identifier for anyone you've looked into and helped out?
No. And I think not at all.
This is like Henry Louis Gates. They're like, you're not white.
That's all this shocking revelation, right? No, by no means. But without getting into, for folks who don't dabble in this, that's easy for them to accept, right? And it's actually sometimes not that easy to see through genealogies either, because genealogies, when we do genealogies, we typically, so there's different avenues, right? You have sacramental records, because most folks in New Mexico prior to 1900 were Catholic, right? Whether, forcefully or not, whether they were baptized, they were Christianized, or, they were married in the church, they had their burial records. So we have the luxury of finding a lot of this information through sacramental records. But if we think about that, right? Think about 365 days a year times how many years they lived. A baptism is one day out of hundreds or thousands of days in their lives. A marriage is one, right? So we're taking snapshots to produce a genealogy on these people. And so you can't simply make some kind of identity off of a simple record like that, right? Unless that record is really explicit and says this person is this, that, or whatever. So genealogies don't do that quite often. There are some instances that do. And then but to supplement that, we have DNA, right? And so through DNA, we have a lot of data that is actually telling us, there's no possible way you are quote unquote pure Spanish. It's not possible. And how do I support that? So from a genealogical and a DNA perspective, the project that I work with, we focus on Y DNA, which is men only inherit Y DNA. So it's your father's 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 father back into time. And both men and women inherit mitochondrial DNA, and that's the opposite spectrum, your mother's 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 mother. So from a statistical standpoint, all the data we've collected in New Mexico says that 15% of all paternal DNA is Native American, right? And that's going to be not only tribal groups of New Mexico, but that could be some of these auxiliary folks and others that came from Mexico with the early settlements, right? So there's both, that plus many other reasons. From a mitochondrial perspective, these are all our ancestral grandmothers. It's 85 to 90% of all of them were Native. Wow. Again, tribal regions here, Genízaro communities, captivity from the outside. We know about the Comanches, Navajos, Utes, etc. That influx of people that came into this region, Pueblo people, by force or not, whatever the case may be, back in 1600s, 1700s, etc. And then all those, again, Mexican groups that came up, right? Because a lot of those early settlers were already mestizos, right? Mm-hmm. So their foremothers were already of Mexican Indian descent. So right off the bat, just from that genetic standpoint, there's no such thing as I'm Spanish. And
boom.
Boom. And then when you add...
Some of you might be wondering, and with reason, about whether we should even be tempted to go down the DNA road at all. We've all seen what happens when certain people identify Native ancestry and immediately start cooking up plans to get a CIB card. And of course, we know about the pretendians who've built entire narratives and careers on false Native heritage or claims to membership. Miguel is often the guy telling people to pump the brakes on that kind of thinking. The goal of research like this isn't to figure out what kind of self-serving steps can be taken or what tribe one might belong to. Rather, he says it's one of many tools for thinking about hybridity and for undoing any pretenses to racial purity. When we find new ways of acknowledging all of our ancestors, we also find ways of embracing all the parts of ourselves. Colonialism taught us that identity was a zero-sum game, but it doesn't have to be.
When you add to that, right, we just think about it from a cultural perspective, right? And, I'm not the cultural expert, but it doesn't take a lot to know that within our food, our language, our customs and traditions, there's tons of elements of Spanish identity. Lots of stuff that was brought from Spain by our ancestors, but things were modified and tweaked and absorbed and shared amongst, even I love to use language because these are things that nobody ever taught me, and I had no idea, right? Like the simple words of the comal, chocolate, the most common words that we use, right? These things, osha, right? As a Spanish-speaking person of New Mexico growing up, right? To me, I would have just assumed, osha is of Spanish origin, right? It's modified, right? So quota, quota, right? All those types of things. We as
osha.
All right. So it's those types.
When people of mixed ancestry were denigrated by Americans after annexation and then given a new identity, that new identity was like a layer of bad whitewash attempting to hide centuries of relations.
My grandparents always said, they were Spanish, and I think that's a common tale of a lot of New Mexican families is one, a narrative that's actually pretty false and that you've touched on in this. I mean, not just touched in, but gone into the depth about this really false narrative that we all grew up with and that our grandparents grew up with, and this obsession with fiestas and I am holding on to that as a means of defining who they are and their culture. And then also recognizing that was something that created safety and allowed them to survive or try to navigate racism, and also this perseverance of being American and having this identity that was more American, even though it was Spanish, but more American somehow than saying, like acknowledging their indigenous roots or relationship to that. And so I think it allowed them to maintain a whiteness that was helpful to them in their everyday lives. And also I've never really, like, my grandparents wrapping their head around being Mexican in any way or having a relationship to Mexico is not really something that they like conceptualize or, there's a huge difference to them between their even genetics and those who have just like crossed the border or just come to New Mexico from Mexico, and they're like, oh, we're very different. And there's a distinction there, which is racist. And also, there's this idea that like, okay, we never crossed the border. We've just been here.
Many in our communities, as Maida Branch talks about, ended up believing that narrative themselves and internalized that oppression. I have people like that in my own family. It was a way to survive. It was also to some a way of enacting other forms of lateral oppression. For anyone who remains invested in narratives that Spaniards arrived here by helicopter and kerplunked into the land, one need only listen to the stories that surface in whispers, Maida said. The ones that take place behind closed doors, the ones that are often fragmented or steeped in shame, the ones taken for granted, rationalized, and put away like old quilts in a trunk. If you go to Maida's homepage, Maida Goods, you'll see the words, a love story, a coming home story. That captures it all. A coming home not only to place, but also to self and ancestors.
When we do talk about how Native specifically my grandmother is and her grandmother was, coming from, being her grandmother was stolen. It's unclear, like at birth or pretty soon after. And what we're finding out is more and more each day. It's like kind of crazy with these histories that have been completely erased. It's like I find myself becoming attached to one narrative and I'm like, oh, like she was Zuni. Like it's so clear she was Zuni. And then we're like, we actually do some more, like, there's no way to really dig in terms of documents. Like we have, birth certificates that say it says like, Indian slave under her name. But other than that, there's nothing really else in writing as to where she is or where she came from. And I remember talking to Gino Antonio, who I work with him. I didn't touch on this in my intro, but Maida, my project and company, I work with Indigenous artists from the Southwest and have an artist collective and support and promote their work and their stories. And Gino Antonio, he's a horse healer from Window Rock, Arizona. I remember talking to him at one point about me, like wanting to know more about this side of my family and not really having any written anything to refer to. And him very like calmly telling me like, the written word and things being documented with pen and paper. That's a new thing. That's something that, the white man brought us, and that wasn't always what we did or how we shared information. And all of it was oral and passed down. And the only way you're going to recover that is if you listen and if you are quiet and if you go by yourself to the mountains or to where your great grandmother was from, and you'll hear the wind do something over here, and you'll turn and you'll walk that way, and then you'll see a branch move that way and you'll know to walk that way. And as much as he was saying that literally, he was, the literal like follow those things, listen to those things, he was also saying, you're going to have to look in a different way and listen in a different way. And eventually he said, you'll be welcomed home, and you'll see her and you'll see where she was from and she'll lead you there. But you're going to have to be okay with like learning about her in another way.
Even with all the attempts at erasure, we have to look in a different way. We have to shift our understandings of the cultural practices of this area and begin to really think about how those practices actually reflect the mixed ancestries of the people. Diego calls this the gradients of indigeneity.
Our family members haven't fully processed what happened and, what that makes us today. And I think that until we do that, we want to talk about it, which is what's so great about this podcast is that, like, how cool it is that we can kind of, formally and also informally talk about this, ephemeral, like, relationship we have to our own, like, race and racism in our lives and generational, what's been passed down. And that's the first step, is us just like bringing light to it. And how beautiful that you all are creating a space in which to do that, because you're exactly right. Up until now, for the most part, it's kept behind, doors and was just whispers, amongst our grandparents, and something that you didn't talk about and that you kept hidden in the corner. And to shine light on it is so healing. And so, like, I can see my grandparents feeling proud of who they are and more proud of these things that they didn't think they should feel proud of. And when they see my cousin and I, like, celebrating them and talking about them and writing about them in a way that is bringing ideally honor and reverence to these things, I think it allows them to not feel so ashamed of who they are, where they come from.
We're still processing and finding ways of talking about what wasn't talked about. And we're trying to listen to those parts of our own stories that were silenced.
It goes back to my point where I think that Genízaro is synonymous with a lot more, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the misconception is that we've been taught through education that Genízaro was a specific person in a specific time, and that they evolved. They were no longer Genízaro. So for us today, to be a Genízaro is inaccurate, right? I think that's criticism, right? That in itself, because how can we are not that enslaved individual from generations ago. We've come to this contemporary, right? However, in the way I see that is that, and so we go back to education and say, yeah, okay, Genízaros were these people of the 1700s, and then 1821 came, and then term disappeared, so therefore there are no more Genízaros, etc. So how can you be one of them? Well, the argument today is that through customs and traditions, we're keeping their memories, their activities, their presence alive within us. And so, when I say I'm Genízaro, I'll interchange, right? I'll say I'm a Chicano. I'll say I won't say I'm Hispano anymore. I'll say I'm a mestizo. I will say I'm a Genízaro. But when I say that, it can be misinterpreted. But what I am saying is I'm an essence of those people before me, right? And I'm not saying that I am the enslaved individual. And I think that's where criticism comes from, is because from that perspective. And then I think in addition to that, the criticism is that we are trying to say that we are something that we are not, that we are primarily indigenous people. And then the question is, how do you define indigenous, right? Are we in Native American indigenous? Are we regional indigenous? And I would argue yes, right? Because our families have been here for 400 years plus. So we're indigenous to the region, indigenous to the landscape, the foods, etc. So there's all these criticisms, but folks can be quick to criticize, but they got to listen to these conversations and hear what the complexities are all about. And I think as the conversations happen, they're going to say, okay, I kind of get that, right? And maybe back off from those identities.
Now you're talking sense. Got this pine cone in my brain, got my eyes open, I'm saying it's that wake up, that breaking free for them chains.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Tilt Unsettled. This episode was produced by Alicia with interviews by Diego and post-production by Christian. Our theme song is rapper Wake Self's Holy Water. It can be found on his posthumous album, Ready to Live. Unsettled is a 9-part series. Keep listening on our website at sfai.org or the SFAI channel at podbean.com. This project is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts.
Street gotcha, bodhisattva, I'm reaching holy water. Yeah, bump in the trunk. Third eye opened up, third eye opened up. Yeah, bump in the trunk. Third eye opened up, third eye opened up. Keep it alkaline, keep it alkaline. Keep it alkaline, keep it alkaline. What's up?